Hello, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer. Today, I'm joined by Gerbrandt van Heerden. Gerbrandt, how are you doing?
Hello, just baking here under the Cape Town sun, but otherwise I'm all good.
Well, I'm becoming squelchy and marshy under the Johannesburg rain. I don't know. Chris, how are you doing? Chris Hutton.
God, doing well, thanks. Same as you, Nick. I'm surprised we haven't washed away yet. Looks like another rough few days for many people in Johannesburg, especially. Unfortunately, but we'll see how quickly the rain falls.
I've seen there's some news now about the flooding causing the rain causing problems in parts of Joburg. So hopefully that doesn't get too bad. So what's happened since we last spoke to everyone in the audience? Well, we had, of course, the State of the Nation address, where Cyril Ramaphosa, as predicted, gave a speech full of lots of things that people didn't take that seriously. The EFF did something theatrical that perhaps was a little bit more exciting than I thought. I predicted that the EFF would hold things up for an hour and a half. I think they only held it up for about 45 minutes. But it was far more dramatic than usual when they apparently charged the stage to try and get on and stand in front of Ramaphosa to protest various things. So what was announced in the State of the Nation address? Well, there were a lot of familiar hits. Of course, Cyril talked about increasing social grants, which I think he does in every single State of the Nation address, and said that this would be covered in the budget. Cyril praised the 1,000 Black Industrialists program, which is, I'd say, to say controversial program is understating it. There was no mention of protecting property rights, of the expropriation bill, of ending BEE procurement, and the SONA Commission report. A lot of familiar notes. The stuff that made headlines, however, was, of course, that he did officially go ahead and announce the state of disaster regarding Eskom. A very strange thing, a piece of legislation that was designed to help people after floods and landslides and hurricanes. It's now being used to cover up government incompetence, I guess. And that there would be a minister in the presidency to, quote, project manage Eskom. So in response to this, we had ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula respond to criticism of the state of disaster, which has been out in the public space. Like we've given some. He said concerns about things like corruption and overreach are not far-fetched. And we have given you a firm commitment, Mbalula said. Expenditure will not be allowed to get out of hand. We must not allow a state of disaster like we saw in the past to repeat itself at the moment. There are checks and balances, he said. But he didn't really elaborate on what those checks and balances were. And in justifying the state of disaster, Ramaphosa said, quote, in a time of crisis, we need a single point of command and a single line of march. And that it was time to invest those powers in the single contact person, who in this case would be Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, who was the head of the state of disaster under COVID. And in fact, the state of disaster, as far as I understand, it looks all very similar to how it was set up under COVID. So it seems like the ANC believes that the state of disaster previously was some great success, and that there will be magical checks and balances that didn't exist last time, but hasn't announced what any of those are. So I guess let me start with you, Chris. What was your takeaway from SONA? What's your takeaway from the state of disaster stuff? I do note that the DA, which initially very foolishly sort of supported the state of disaster, has now desperately tried to backtrack and say, no, we didn't mean this state of disaster. We wanted, I think the phrase they used was a ring-fenced state of disaster. They should have really known better.
Yeah, just on that DA point, I think you can agree with the technicalities, but now you have to spend a lot more time looking like you're backtracking or wasting time defining what you meant in the first place and that sort of thing. And I think that's not the kind of space you want to be in as an opposition party or just a political party. Now you have to worry the whole time about countering narratives and whatever. You should have set the narrative better, I think, in this particular case. Just on the SONA itself, we have covered it in some depth in our latest risk alert for those who might be interested in especially trying out the CRA's free trial, and you can get access to that. We'll also be releasing a client note just in more depth in terms of writing. But sort of the high level summary, I think it's a reinforcement example of how devoid of good policy ideas and reforms the ANC is, now going as far as a state of disaster to really try and circumvent the problems that they've caused, that their ideology and policies have caused. The ministers already have power to, for example, end preferential procurement, to suspend a lot of these policies that inhibit turning around Eskom. You don't need a state of disaster for any of this stuff. Having now a minister of electricity in the presidency, I think it continues the trend of Ramaphosa increasing the sort of centralization and the power of the executive. That has been a trend in his presidency up until this point, and I think he's sort of throwing around so desperately for ideas. That's what he's going for now, is just trying to keep things as close to him as possible. That doesn't mean he'll implement oversight and hold people responsible. It just means he wants to be seen, I think, to be doing something, quote unquote. So everything is within that lens of heading towards an election next year, and he and the NEC need to be seen that they're taking charge now. So they're going to try and see what sort of sticks. In terms of major policy notes, it was interesting, I think. Nothing on the NHI, for example, but a clear note that they're working to implement the basic income grant. I think that the COVID-19 relief grant, that 350 Rand, that will now be adapted into different forms and might become some sort of basic income grant. That isn't going to go away. In terms of our own data and research, with the steady trend you see in the number increase of people who receive grants, that's been steadily growing, whereas the number of people in employment has been declining. And I think that's going to continue. That's maybe one of the clearest things the ANC think they can offer people is grants. They can't really offer much else. And then just a final note on the SONA from my side, I think maybe a sense of now it's become, you've still got considerations of ideology and wanting to pursue the revolution, all this sort of stuff, be the custodian of society. But I think the overriding factor is becoming, how do we try and look like we're doing something and also not upset too much of the interest groups within the party. So now it's a case of we need to remain in power for as long as possible, retain control, retain access to resources, for corrupt purposes and sort of personal enrichment. So how do we not rock that boat too much? And I think that's why you won't see, for example, a radical cabinet reshuffle, things like that. You're going to see now someone like Gwede, whether he's moved to Minister of Electricity or stays Minister of Minerals and Energy, he'll retain that position because he gave Ramaphosa support during Phala Phala. So you shouldn't expect these radical names to be ousted. I think they'll stay within the ambit of the upper echelons of the party.
So on the electricity front, there was a lot of stuff in there about that we've heard from government before, quite a bit of which I think we're sort of broadly supportive of, stuff like increasing the amount of involvement of the private sector in electricity generation and stuff like that. But we're still sitting with some of the basic problems, like the unbundling of Eskom, which was supposed to happen back in 2020, 2019, that part of the year. And despite Andre de Ruyter saying that from Eskom's side, they've done everything they need to do, it's just not moving ahead. It just stays where it is. And I think you really saw that reflected, Gerbrandt, in the tenor of how most of the media, even the mainstream media, which until relatively recently was much more favorable to Ramaphosa, is that there just was an awful lot of cynicism and sort of, whatever, the speech doesn't matter. What's your take on the whole thing in general? What's your take on the electricity stuff specifically?
Yeah, so in his introduction, President Ramaphosa once again mentioned that we are a resilient people. I think many South Africans would love to, I think we're tired of being resilient in the first place. And I think another takeaway from this,
it would be nice to finish the year feeling like we could take it easy,
Yeah, exactly. But I think another takeaway is that we have to focus on action from the government. It's the same promises over and over again. And I think this has led to a break in the relationship between business and society and the government. Businesses' response to the SONA and what President Ramaphosa said was very muted. Everyone's pretty cynical. Many business leaders have said that, we've heard these things 4 years ago. These things were supposed to be implemented 4 years ago. Here we are repeating them again, saying that we will implement them in the future. And you've had the government energy action plan that was introduced by Ramaphosa last year, and load shedding has just gotten worse. And I think a lot of South Africans are getting to that point where they realize they are on their own. They have to, instead of trying to listen or instead of listening to what the government plans on fixing, how they're going to fix basic service delivery, load shedding, I think a lot of communities and businesses are realizing that they can't wait for the government anymore. In order for the economy to go on and for jobs to be saved, people will have to, band together and fix things themselves. And I think one of the funniest phenomenons on the African continent in general is that you sit with these dictatorships who want to centralize their power. But Africa is actually, because of that, because the state is so useless, it's actually a hotbed for liberal economics and privatization, because lots of people and communities, even in rural areas, are generating their own electricity, fixing their own water infrastructure. So I think that's just one of my takeaways from the SONA. It's the same old, same old. The only exception really is that the state of disaster announcement. And we're going to add another minister to our already bloated cabinet and our bloated wage bill. We're just going to add to that. So there's a lot of promises, but not a lot of steps in action from the government.
So, Chris, any final thoughts before we move on?
Just that I think it sort of reinforced what I thought came out of the ANC policy conference end of last year, where it's just a redoubling down of those big points in terms of policy that you've come to expect now. So yes, we want business and state to work together. We want social compacts, but we also won't let go of those essential matters that mean we retain ultimate control over the economy and society. So you don't see a radical departure in that way. And I don't think you should expect that anytime soon. I don't know. Maybe the ANC does realize that they're in this bad a position now, that a lot of polling shows for their performance next year, but they just can't. They're too inhibited by, I think, their own ideological requirements to shift away from that.
That definitely seems to be the case. The inertia is incredibly overwhelming. And I think that's kind of what everyone has taken away from this speech. Right, so let's move on to the future. One of the very big questions in South Africa right now is this question of, will the ANC and EFF be able to form a coalition in 2024 if the ANC drops below 50% and needs the EFF in order to form a government? We're getting lots of complicated signals from the ANC on this one. So the first thing to note is, let's just hone in on this very specific example of what happened in Parliament. So the EFF tries to climb onto the stage. The president, they say, to protest, and this saw the sort of presidential protection services and parliamentary police and all that thing storm into the chamber and drag them out, which led to these quite dramatic photos of kind of people in like camouflage and helmets and stuff dragging EFF MPs out of the house. And Julius Malema said that this was proof that we were now living in a dictatorship where Ramaphosa could do as he pleased. There was some criticism from other opposition parties, and there was also some support for what had happened there from other opposition parties. So Becky Cele, the Minister of Police, said that it was very important that the officers stormed in at that moment because the president's life could have been in danger. He referenced the murder of Verwoerd in Parliament, saying, this is a country where this kind of thing happens, so you need to protect the president at all costs because it can happen at any time. This was supported by the Freedom Front Plus, who said that it was right that the president was protected by the protection unit. However, the DA had a different take. They said that while they would have been allowed to come in and remove the EFF at the orders of the Speaker, that the security services had in fact rushed in before the Speaker had given express permission. She did later give permission to them. And that this violation of the rules of Parliament was something that was likely to be used to either intimidate MPs in the future, or it was a bad precedent. So I guess, to determine who's right here, you have to kind of think to yourself, was there a reasonable threat to the president's life, as Bekele claims that there may have been? Now, if you put that in the kind of broader context, that's a very interesting idea. According to Bekele, there is a reasonable chance that the EFF would have attempted to assassinate the president in the House of Parliament during a televised address with their MPs. And at the same time, his party looks like it's going to be going into coalition with the EFF in some parts of the country. Gerbrandt, what do you make of this? Who do you think is right in the argument over this specific issue? And what do you think this says about the broader coalition discussion between the ANC and EFF?
Yeah, so I think it's a very interesting situation. You have some ANC members admitting that they think that the EFF is uncontrollable and can even be violent to, their number one, to President Ramaphosa himself. But then you also have, on the other hand, where they are so determined to get the DA coalitions out of Gauteng and the IFP coalitions out of KwaZulu-Natal, that they seem to, they're so desperate to retain that power that they're willing to get into the same bed as the EFF. And I think that's something that the DA has realized, is it's not worth going into a coalition with unstable and unreliable political party. And I also think that the EFF they don't really have any ambitions to rule nationally. They just want to cause chaos for whoever is in control. And I think that's something that their voters and their support base appreciates. So I think it's definitely a gamble for the ANC to align itself closer with the EFF in 2024. I think maybe they have the idea that they could maybe tame the EFF beast. But I think the EFF has shown that it is actually pretty effective in being the tail that wags the dog. And if the ANC wants to take that risk, then I guess it will make for a very interesting 2024 election year. But yeah, that's my take on it.
So I think it was City Press that reported that there is sort of this dispute within the ANC is now actually got factions, and even one of them has a name, one calling itself the Chris Hani Cabal, which is supposedly Ramaphosa, Gwede Mantashe, Mlondi Gubele, and Enoch Korongwana are all working together to, they think, limit the influence that the EFF might have over the party. They're worried about going into coalition with the EFF could hurt the ANC's electoral prospects, which is kind of a funny thing to think about, because I think the only time I've ever heard this argument is the EFF is people saying that the EFF going into coalition with the ANC would hurt their prospects. But clearly the ANC, I think, also recognizes, and this is one of the secrets to their success, that a lot of South Africans are not quite as radical as the EFF. And at the same time, Paul Mashatile and the Hattingh ANC, led by Panyaza Lesufi, are far more eager to get into a coalition agreement with the EFF. Chris, what do you make of all this?
Look, I think it points to maybe the EFF having run out of policy ideas. They have this opportunity once a year where they can disrupt the SONA, and that's what they can do, sort of thing. So, I mean, a lot of our polling and what other organizations have also done, you see them reaching a certain ceiling in terms of their support. So I wonder, despite the ample opportunity that there should be for them to grow, given the country's very serious problems that they can play to in sort of a populist way, maybe people see through that to an extent that they don't breach maybe 15% even in terms of support at the voting booth. What I found most striking was just some of the images of President Ramaphosa sitting on the stage and with various military, police sort of people around him. And I think we should not too easily, despite there are many issues, and I mean, the party can't even sometimes pay staff and all that sort of stuff, but the risk of an ANC pressed into a corner all the more using state, what's the plural, apparatuses to keep themselves in power, to exercise very wide-ranging executive power to ensure that things go the way that they want. Now, one can make aspersions and allegations about things like election interference, influencing the press, maybe the courts. I don't think you should discount that. Don't discount if they really realize that they'll lose access to patronage networks, all that sort of stuff, what they've used to build up their support. If they see this is coming next year, pursuing different ways to retain power. So I'm sort of using that image as this, that I really want to concretize my thinking around, where the more desperate they become, the more radical they could go with implementing certain policies and ideas, and even trying to distract in different ways. So now maybe saying it's useful now to have the story that maybe there's a faction again within the ANC that doesn't want to work with the EFF because, don't worry, Ramaphosa again will win out. He'll convince the others that you shouldn't work with the EFF. You should still vote for the ANC. We won't go with a radical party, put your faith in us, as he did, as was his sort of mandate in the previous general election. So these things are also useful in terms of his own PR, I think.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question to think about kind of gaming forward is the ANC, if it gets 45% in the next election, Ramaphosa's position in the party is going to be somewhat different. Some may make the argument that the only reason anyone voted for the party at all is because Ramaphosa was at the top of its ticket. But others might say that he's led them to ruin and he's dropped them below 50% and therefore needs to go. And then it doesn't matter whether he's sincere or not about keeping the party out of the arms of the EFF. He may not be able to make a decision. Gerbrandt, any final thoughts on this?
No final thoughts except I agree with Chris that I think the EFF feels like they may have reached their electoral ceiling, and so they're upping the antics. And I think that's simply a warning sign to any political party that goes into a coalition with the EFF. Is you're not going to have a stable partner to get things done.
So the EFF has put a lot of eggs in the basket of what they call as some sort of great national shutdown, which they want to take place on the 20th of March. And I wonder how much is actually going to come out of that. I think they're probably taking a bit of a risk because they may show themselves off to be a little bit less powerful than they like to project. Mm-hmm. Anyway, interesting to think about. Excuse me. All right, let's move on to another topic, and this is a specific case when it comes to Eskom and the question of whether it should be allowed to break some of the rules to generate more electricity. Now, most people, when they hear it described like that, will say, yes, of course, Eskom should be able to break the rules. But in this particular case, Eskom is asking for an exemption from the, this is a technical term, flue gas desulfurization unit, which removes the sulfur oxide from the emissions from, I think, the Kusile plant. And Kusile is damaged. I don't know how, because it's one of our newest power plants. But anyway, it's seriously damaged. And Eskom says that they will be able to get it back up and running at full capacity a year earlier if they are granted an exemption to the sulfur oxide emissions controls. They said that basically, because then they wouldn't have to connect the current system to this complicated filtering system. So essentially what Eskom is asking for is permission to pollute more in order to restore what they say would be 2,100 megawatts of generating capacity to the grid much quicker than planned. Chris, what do you make of this? On one hand, we've got sort of sulfur oxide, which will no doubt reduce nearby people's quality of life a little bit. In the long term, it may even lead to some people dying who maybe wouldn't have. But at the same time, not having electricity is also really bad for people's health and well-being and livelihood and lives. So what do you think should be done in this case?
Yeah, now we have to engage in some of that very dirty U-word exercises, utilitarianism, where you try and weigh up what's the greatest number for the greatest good, which I find a very difficult exercise in moral philosophy. I guess that's the point of the idea, the sort of school of thought itself. I guess, yeah, you weigh up sort of trying to get out of the hole that you're in and pursuing every possible route out of that. That doesn't mean, even if we do then suspend certain regulations and rules, that you'll actually get more, increased electricity generation. It might just be another opportunity for, I don't know.
Right, we might get the same power, but just dirtier.
Yeah, exactly. And which department approves it, and who do they give those licenses or those exemptions to? Is it, you with your political influence? As we know, Nicholas, you can go to the Department of environmental, et cetera, and make sure that you get that license or that exemption or that tender, and someone else doesn't. So there's always that risk in the South African context that because of the just network of sort of corrupt tenders and applications, that yes, you want to reach this end goal. Maybe, for example, you want to solve the electricity crisis, so you call for a state of disaster. Well, when you do that, and it's the ANC that implements it, they're not going to do it in a ring-fenced way. They're going to do it in a way that suits them and their connections the most. So on the merits of it, maybe a good sort of solution to try and do both small and major scale things like this to try and see if we can generate and take some pressure off of Eskom. But I just don't see the sort of coordination or the clarity of mind to actually focus on the end goal. So there's always going to be other things like undermining the exercise itself. But in principle, I mean, I want there to be cheap, abundant electricity. I guess I'm more, if I was doing a Lord of the Rings role-playing game, I would want to be Isengard. So I would be personally happy with that, but I don't know about everyone else.
It's kind of interesting as well, that shows that some parts of the ideology just, are inflexible while others are bendable. So Eskom, ANC's commitment to environmental goals, yeah, that can be bent, whatever. But commitment to race law, commitment to preferential procurement, commitment to those policies, no, we can't touch those. We'd rather pump poison into the air than let people of any race compete equally for procurement stuff. Harry, what do you make of this?
Yeah, we've reached the point where things have gotten so bad that we have to choose between having the lights on or saving the environment, having clean air. And when we do reach such a state, I would always say that people's jobs and income should be protected as much as possible. I know that's very controversial. I might get a lot of criticism saying that, but I think I will agree with you and Chris. I think there's a quick fix to many of the energy problems that we have here. Just take away the policy blockages that are preventing the private sector from becoming more involved, that are preventing people of merit to work in our power stations and taking up senior positions. But instead, we are willing to bend the laws protecting the environment to get Eskom back on track. But it's not gonna. There's just so many factors that you have to take into account to get Eskom back on track, and this won't be a solution. And I think the government is all about, plans once again, but, implementing the right plans, they're quite allergic to that. So,
Yeah, definitely. All right, that is all the time we have for today. We hope that you enjoyed the show. If you like the show, please subscribe to us on the podcast apps. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, depending on what platform you're checking out. And we will see you tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. I hope that you all have a wonderful day. Cheers, everyone.